You all moneycard me and I am done.
Have you ever seen someone become poorer the moment they started earning more money? Not because they were reckless, not because they gambled, but because an entire family quietly turned one person's salary into a family inheritance. That was Obinna's life. And by the time he realized what was happening, he had already lost almost everything. People always celebrate the child who finally succeeds, the graduate who gets a good job, the son or daughter who moves to Lagos, the one everyone proudly points at during family gatherings and say, God has remembered our family. But very few people talk about what comes after the celebration. Nobody tells you that sometimes success comes with invincible chains. Before you know it, your salary no longer belongs to you. It belongs to your parents, your siblings, your uncles, your aunties, distant cousins, and even relatives you only see once every December. That was exactly the life Obinna was living. At 31, he worked as an engineer in Lagos. To anyone looking from the outside, he looked like a man who had figured his life out. He dressed well, smiled easily, cracked jokes with everyone around him, and never allowed anyone to see the battles he fought behind closed doors. His colleagues admired him because he never looked stressed. His neighbors respected him because he was always calm. Even strangers assumed he was enjoying life. What nobody knew was that Obinna had forgotten what it felt like to spend money on himself without first thinking about who else needed it more. Every month followed the same pattern. The moment his salary entered his account, his phone would almost immediately come alive. His mother would call first. If it wasn't his mother, it would be his father. Then an uncle would remember he existed. An aunt would suddenly want to check up on him. A cousin who had disappeared for almost a year would magically remember his phone number. Sometimes, Obinna would laugh with his colleague and joke that someone in the village must have installed an alarm that rang every time his salary was paid. Everyone laughed whenever he said it, but deep inside, he wasn't joking because almost every conversation ended exactly the same way. Someone needed money. And somehow, saying no never felt like an option. Despite carrying responsibilities far beyond his age, there was one part of his life that still brought him genuine happiness, which was Ada. She was the kind of woman who made difficult days feel lighter. She never measured love by expensive gifts or fancy restaurants. On evenings when Obinna suggested buying roasted corn and pear from a roadside seller instead of eating in a restaurant, Ada was always happy to follow along. To her, the conversations mattered more than the location. Some evenings, they would sit inside his parked car with the windows down, sharing roasted corn while talking about work, family, childhood memories, and the future they hope to build together. Those simple moments became Obinna's escape from the endless responsibilities waiting for him every payday. Little by little, marriage became part of their conversations. Ada often teased him about how long she had waited, joking that if he delayed much longer, she might end up proposing to herself. Obinna would always laugh, but this time there was something different. He finally admitted that he had started preparing for their future. Without telling anyone in his family, he had opened a separate savings account. It was his wedding fund. For the first time in years, he had chosen himself. Ada could hardly contain her excitement. She celebrated that decision as though they had already fixed a wedding date. Seeing her happiness filled Obinna with hope. He began imagining a small home of their own, children running around the living room, peace, a future that belonged to the two of them instead of an entire extended family. That night, he slept with more hope than he had felt in years. He had no idea that within 3 weeks, those dreams would begin slipping through his fingers. It started with a phone call just before 6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. The moment he answered, he knew something was terribly wrong. His younger brother could barely speak through his tears. After several painful seconds, he finally managed to tell Obinna that their younger sister Ngozi was gone. For a few moments, the world simply stopped. Nothing made sense anymore. The hours that passed followed like scenes from Nollywood movies. There were hospital visits, police reports, neighbors gathering outside the family house, relatives traveling from different states, women crying loudly, children looking confused, his mother collapsing repeatedly from grief, his father sitting in complete silence, looking like a man who had suddenly grown 20 years older. Obinna wanted to mourn his sister. Instead, he found himself carrying responsibilities. Before the family had even finished discussing their grief, another conversation quietly took over, which was money. At the first family meeting, everyone naturally turned toward Obinna. Nobody asked whether he was financially ready. Nobody asked how much he had managed to save over the years. Nobody even asked whether he was emotionally strong enough to shoulder everything. It was simply assumed that because he worked in Lagos and earned the highest salary in the family, he would take over the burial. And that was exactly what happened. Obinna emptied the accounts he had been building for his wedding. When that wasn't enough, he carried another savings. When that money finished too, he borrowed from friends. Yet somehow, the expenses never seemed to end. Every few days, another payment appeared. The coffin, church arrangements, food for guests, canopies, chairs, transportation, village contributions, traditional rites, unexpected expenses nobody had mentioned before. Each time Obinna convinced himself that the funeral was finally over, another relative would remember something else that still needed to be paid for. By the time everything ended, years of saving had disappeared completely. His wedding account looked as though it had never existed. Everything he had built for his future vanished within a matter of weeks. Through all of it, Ada remained by his side. She didn't complain, she didn't pressure him. Instead, she quietly became part of the family. She helped with cooking during the funeral. She comforted his grieving mother. She stayed late into the night during family meetings. When Obinna blamed himself for losing everything he had saved, Ada gently reminded him that money could always be earned again. According to her, honoring his sister was never a mistake, and together they would rebuild everything they had lost. Those words became the only thing keeping Obinna hopeful. He truly believed the worst had passed. Unfortunately, his family was only getting started. Barely 2 weeks after the burial, his father's name appeared on his phone. Obinna answered with genuine excitement. For a brief moment, he thought his father simply wanted to know how he was coping after everything that had happened. Instead, the conversation quickly shifted in another direction. His father explained that Ngozi's burial had exposed one major problem, which was their family did not own a proper burial land. According to him, they needed to buy one immediately so that future burials would not become so stressful. Before Obinna could fully process what he was hearing, his father had already found a piece of land. The only thing left was payment, and naturally, everyone expected Obinna to handle it. Obinna sat quietly after the call ended. His wedding savings were gone. He was already repaying loans. His bank account was struggling to recover from funeral expenses. Yet another family responsibility had landed on his shoulders. He looked at the framed picture of Ngozi resting on his table. He closed his eyes, took a long, heavy breath, and once again, he chose everyone else before himself. Without realizing it, Obinna had just taken the first step toward the decision that would eventually change his entire life. The truth is that nobody wakes up one morning and says, from today, everybody should depend on me. No, it usually begins with one emergency, then one sacrifice, then one favor. Before long, saying yes becomes your identity and everyone forgets you ever had dreams of your own. That was exactly what was happening to Obinna. After Ngozi's burial, life slowly returned to normal. Or at least, that was what everyone else believed. But Obinna knew better. Every month, a large part of his salary disappeared into the family burial land his father insisted they buy after Ngozi's funeral. Without complaining, he quietly adjusted his own lifestyle. He stopped eating out. He reduced how often he drove his car. He began calculating fuel before making unnecessary trips. Whenever his colleagues suggested hanging out after work, he always found one excuse or another. He convinced himself these sacrifices were only temporary. The wedding could wait, his comfort could wait, his own happiness could wait, as long as his family was okay. He believed everything would eventually fall into place. But life has a way of testing people who never set boundaries. One Wednesday afternoon, while he was buried in his office work, his father's name appeared on his phone. For the first time in weeks, Obinna smiled before answering. Maybe this time, his father simply wanted to hear his voice. Maybe he wanted to ask how his son was coping after everything that had happened. The conversation started warmly enough. They exchanged greetings. They spoke briefly about work and health. For a few precious moments, Obinna felt like a son instead of a provider. Then, almost as if following a familiar script, the conversation changed. His father explained that he could no longer afford to continue giving Obinna's younger sister her monthly allowance. Without hesitation, he informed Obinna that beginning from the following month, that responsibility now belonged to him. The decision had already been made. Nobody asked whether he could afford another monthly commitment. Nobody asked what his own finances looked like. It was simply assumed that he would find a way. When the call ended, Obinna remained seated in complete silence. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised anymore. He was simply exhausted. That evening, Ada visited him after work. She immediately noticed something had changed. There was a heaviness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. She had known Obinna long enough to recognize the difference between ordinary tiredness and the kind of silence that comes from carrying too much. At first, he brushed it aside with his usual smile, but Ada wasn't convinced. After gently pressing him, Obinna finally opened up. He told her about the burial land, the new allowance, the growing responsibilities that never seemed to end. Ada listened quietly from beginning to end. She didn't interrupt. She didn't criticize his family. She simply waited until he finished before asking him one question. Could you honestly afford everything people expected from you? For the first time, Obinna realized he didn't know the answer. That question stayed with him long after Ada had stopped speaking. A few days later, something finally gave him hope again. After months of waiting, Ada had convinced her parents that it was time to properly meet the man she wanted to marry. It wasn't an introduction ceremony, just a simple family lunch. Still, it meant everything. Ada spent the entire week teasing him, joking that her mother had already heard so many good things about him that she was beginning to expect a perfect gentleman. Obinna laughed and reminded her not to oversell him. If her parents discovered he wasn't as amazing as advertised, she would have to refund his expectations, he jokingly said to her. For the first time in a long while, he genuinely looked forward to something. He ironed his best native outfit. He polished his shoes until they shined. Even while driving that morning, he caught himself smiling. Perhaps life was finally giving him a small reason to breathe again. Then, just as he was preparing to leave, his father's call started coming in. 3 calls came in at the same time. The phone refused to stop ringing. At first, Obinna assumed his father simply wanted to wish him well before meeting Ada's parents. Instead, his father urgently asked him to come home immediately. When Obinna explained that he already had an important family meeting to attend, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. His father reluctantly accepted that he could come another day. The conversation ended without a single word of encouragement, no congratulations, no good wishes, no reminder to greet Ada's parents. The call simply ended. As Obinna looked at the blank phone screen, disappointment quietly settled inside him. Ada noticed it immediately. Without saying much, she squeezed his hand gently and said, "Sometimes comfort doesn't need many words." Lunch turned out better than either of them expected. Ada's father welcomed Obinna warmly, asking about his work, his background, and even sharing stories about his own youthful struggles. Her mother behaved exactly like many African mothers. She refused to let Obinna's plate remain empty for more than a few minutes. Every time he claimed he was full, another spoonful of rice mysteriously appeared on his plate. The table was filled with laughter, playful teasing, and stories that made everyone forget about time. For a few beautiful hours, Obinna remembered what peace felt like. As he drove home later that evening, Ada smiled and told him her parents genuinely liked him. Most people would have floated home with excitement after hearing those words. Instead, Obinna felt something completely different. A quiet fear settled in his heart. How could he build a family when the old one refused to loosen its grip? The following afternoon, he honored his promise and traveled to see his father. The visit was short. There was no conversations about his journey, no questions about the meeting with Ada's parents. His father went straight to the reason he had called him. Obina's younger sister had secured admission into the university. It should have been a joyful news, and it was, until the next sentence followed. His father calmly explained that Obinna would now be responsible for paying all her school fees. Again, it wasn't presented as a request. It sounded more like a family decision that everyone had already accepted. Obinna wanted to ask different questions. He wanted to ask some difficult questions. He wanted to know why every responsibility somehow found its way to him. He wanted to ask whether anyone had considered his own future. But years of obedience held those questions beside him. Instead, he quietly agreed to, "I will try, Papa." His father smiled proudly and described him as a responsible son. That word echoed in Obina's mind all the way back to Lagos. Responsible. Everyone praised him for being responsible. Yet nobody ever asked him what that responsibility was slowly taken away from him. Back in Lagos, reality greeted him once again. His salary entered his account, and almost immediately he began calculating expenses: burial land, his sister's allowance, school fees, house rent, electricity, fuel, food, car maintenance, loan repayments. He kept subtracting until its remaining balance became almost laughable. He stared at the screen and couldn't help laughing, not because anything was funny. Sometimes people laugh simply because crying feels too expensive. That month became one of the hardest seasons of his adult life. He quietly stopped eating breakfast. Lunch became an occasional luxury. Some afternoon, garri and salt became enough to silence his hunger until evening. His favorite pair of shoes slowly began coming apart at the side. Instead of replacing them, he polished them carefully every morning, hoping nobody would notice. His car developed strange sounds that any mechanic would have warned him not to ignore. He ignored them anyway. There was always something more important waiting for his money. One Friday evening, Ada decided to surprise him after work. She arrived at his apartment while he was still in the bedroom. As she waited, she wandered into his kitchen. The sight that greeted her broke her heart. The refrigerator was almost empty. Only a few eggs, a bottle of water, and half loaf of bread that remained. The kitchen cupboard looked even worse. A single cup of gari, a cup of rice, a few packets of noodles. The cheerful smile she had arrived with slowly disappeared. When Obinna came out and noticed her expressions, he casually claimed he had simply been too busy to buy groceries. Ada looked at him for a long moment. She knew him too well. Without accusing him, she quietly understood the truth. He had sent his money home again. Obinna didn't deny it. He simply admitted that his family needed help. Ada's eyes filled with tears. Then she gently reminded him of something nobody else had bothered to see. There is a difference between surviving and living. Somewhere along the journey, Obinna had become the last person he cared about. That conversation became the first serious disagreement of their relationship. Not because Ada wanted his money. She wasn't fighting for financial support. She was fighting for the man she loved. She reminded him that he had postponed their wedding, neglected his health, ignored his own needs, and sacrificed every personal dream in the name of responsibility. Then she asked him a question he couldn't answer. When exactly would your own life finally begin? After Ada left, silence filled the apartment. Obinna sat alone in the darkness, replaying those words again and again. Just then, his phone vibrated. The family WhatsApp group had become active. Another relative was seriously ill. Contributions were needed immediately. Before Obinna even finished reading the message, another notification appeared. As usual, the family had already decided that he would coordinate all the payments because he was dependable. They called him dependable, responsible, and reliable. Everyone had beautiful names for his sacrifice. Obinna slowly dropped the phone onto the table and stared into darkness. Then, for the very first time, a frightening thought crossed his mind. Perhaps his family no longer saw him as a son. Perhaps they no longer saw him as a brother. Maybe I have simply become the bank they all depended on. And that realization frightened him more than any bill ever could. A few days after his disagreement with Ada, something unusual happened. His phone became strangely quiet. No relatives asking for money, no family emergencies, no endless notifications from the family WhatsApp group. For the first time in many months, Obinna slept through the night without being awakened by the sound of his phone vibrating beside his bed. He almost convinced himself that maybe life had finally decided to give him a break. Unfortunately, peace was only taking a short break. Payday arrived. As always, the salary alert entered early in the morning. Before Obinna could even smile at the notification, his mother's call came in. The moment he heard her trembling voice, every feeling of relief disappeared. His father had failed in paying the loan attached to the family car. The finance company had arrived that morning and taken the vehicle away. If the outstanding balance wasn't paid immediately, the car would be sold. Obinna quietly looked at the amounts his mother mentioned. It was almost everything he had just earned. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. That car wasn't a luxury. His father depended on it. His younger siblings used it to move around. Without spending another minute thinking about himself, he transferred almost every naira in his account. His mother cried with gratitude and showered him with prayers. She thanked God for giving her such a responsible son. After the call ended, Obinna remained staring at his phone. The prayers echoed in his mind. Then one painful question quietly crossed his heart. Everyone prayed that God would bless him. But had anyone ever prayed that somebody would also remember him when he was the one in need? The following weeks became a battle for survival. He parked his own car because buying fuel had become a luxury. He started trekking short distances under the Lagos sun. At the office, he stopped eating breakfast completely. Whenever colleagues invited him to join them for lunch, he laughed it off with excuses about dieting or trying to save money. Nobody knew hunger was making those decisions for him. His stomach complained every afternoon. His pride simply spoke louder. One evening after work, he returned home exhausted. He opened his fridge. A single bottle of water stared back at him, nothing else. He checked the kitchen cupboard. Only one small cup of rice remained. No stew, no beans, no gari, nothing. He quietly cooked the rice with salt. As he sat alone eating it, a strange thought crossed his mind. Just a few years earlier, he had dreamed about the meals he would one day share with Ada and the family they had planned to build. Now, he was celebrating plain rice because it was the only thing left inside the house. The following day, even that rice finished. Then came another problem: electricity. His unpaid bill finally caught up with him. The lights went off. His apartment became unbearably hot. Darkness filled every corner of the room. His phone battery eventually died, leaving him completely cut off from the outside world. That night, hunger became unbearable. His stomach cramped so violently that he rushed into the bedroom. He bent over the sink, expecting to vomit, but nothing came out. There was nothing left inside him. He slowly slid down the wall and sat on the cold bedroom floor. For the first time in years, Obinna cried. Not because he regretted helping his family, not because life was unfair. He cried because he suddenly realized something heartbreaking. He had spent years rescuing everyone else while nobody had noticed that he too desperately needed someone to rescue him. The following morning, Ada arrived unexpectedly. She had spent the previous night calling him, but to no avail. When nobody answered, worry pushed her straight to his apartment. Obinna eventually opened the door. The moment Ada saw him, her heart sank. His face had become noticeably thinner. The cheerful sparkle in his eyes had disappeared. The apartment felt unusually warm and lifeless. Without saying anything, she quietly walked into the kitchen. She opened the freezer, closed it, opened the cupboard, closed that too. Everything she needed to know was already sitting silently before her. When she returned to the sitting room, she looked at Obinna with tears gathering in her eyes. He tried to smile. It was the weakest smile she had ever seen. He attempted to explain that work had simply kept him too busy to buy groceries. Ada gently shook her head. She knew better. She understood exactly what happened because that was not the first time he was telling her that. Once again, he had sent almost everything home. She reminded him of something. There is a difference between people needing help and people becoming comfortable depending on someone else's sacrifice. Those two things are not the same. Somewhere along the journey, Obinna had stopped caring for himself because everyone else had become used to him always saying yes. That conversation became the turning point neither of them expected. Ada wasn't angry because of money. She wasn't protecting her own interests. She was protecting the future husband she was slowly watching disappear. Later that evening, she made a decision that surprised even Obinna. She drove straight to his parents' house. This time, she refused to remain silent. Several family members happened to be gathered there. His parents, his younger siblings, a few uncles and aunts, several cousins who had come visiting. The atmosphere was warm until everyone noticed the seriousness on Ada's face. Very respectfully, she began asking simple questions. Questions nobody had ever thought to ask themselves. When was the last time anyone checked whether Obinna had eaten? When was the last time somebody asked whether he could genuinely afford every responsibility placed on his shoulders? Did anyone know he had emptied his salary to recover the family car? Did anyone know he had been skipping meals? Did anyone know he was living in darkness because he couldn't pay his electricity bill? One by one, the questions filled the room with uncomfortable silence. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody argued. Some family members slowly lowered their heads. Others stared at Obinna with genuine shock. For the first time, they were seeing the cost of the sacrifice they had accepted so naturally. Eventually, his father spoke. He quietly admitted that Obinna had never mentioned any of his struggles to him. Ada looked at him gently before asking him one final question. Had anyone ever thought to ask? That question settled over the room like heavy harmattan dust. Even the relatives who usually had something to say remained silent. One elderly uncle eventually broke the tension by reminding everyone that supporting family had always been part of African culture. Ada immediately agreed. She respected that tradition. She even admired it. But she gently explained that culture was never meant to destroy one person while protecting everyone else. Family should carry one another, not quietly choose one person to carry everybody. Her words landed differently this time. For the first time since all these responsibilities began, Obinna slowly stood up. His voice remained calm. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He simply spoke honestly. He assured everyone that he loved his family and always would. Supporting his parents and helping his younger siblings would never stop. But something had to change. Over the years, he had unknowingly trained everyone to believe he would never say no. He had convinced everyone that his own dreams could always wait. His own health could always wait. His own happiness could always wait. From that day forward, he decided things would be different. He would still help whenever he genuinely could. But healthy adults would also take responsibility for their own lives. The room exploded almost immediately. Some relatives accused Ada of changing him. Others called him proud. One auntie muttered that marriage had entered his head. Another cousin whispered that success had made him disrespect his elders. The accusation came from every direction. Obinna listened quietly. Months earlier, these words would have broken him, but this time they didn't. Because for the first time in his life, he understood something important. Setting boundaries was not the same thing as abandoning your family. The weeks that followed were difficult. Some relatives stopped calling, a few avoided him completely, others complained bitterly. But something unexpected happened. Life continued. People adjusted. His younger sisters began taking part-time jobs while studying. Even his father returned to consulting work instead of depending entirely on his son. One uncle reopened the workshop he had abandoned years earlier. Little by little, everyone discovered they were stronger than they had allowed themselves to believe. 6 months later, Obinna and Ada finally got married. It wasn't the biggest wedding in town. There was no luxury event center, no celebrity musicians, no unnecessary competition, just family, close friends, good food, music, laughter, and genuine happiness. Some relatives chose not to attend, others came reluctantly. But none of that mattered anymore. Obinna wasn't measuring success by the number of guests. He was celebrating something far greater. He had finally started building his own family instead of postponing it forever. 3 years later, he stood outside the modest house he and Ada had worked hard to buy. Their little daughter ran happily around the compound, laughing as children often do without a single worry in the world. Watching her, Obinna smiled quietly. He realized that if he had continued carrying everyone's body without limits, moments like this might never have existed. He had never stopped loving his family. He had simply learned that love should never require someone to disappear completely. And honestly, this is a part of Obinna's story that stayed with me. Helping family is one of the most beautiful parts of our African culture. But when kindness becomes entitlement, when sacrifice becomes expectation, when one person's future is repeatedly postponed so everyone else can remain comfortable, then something has gone terribly wrong. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is not to give more. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach people to stand on their own feet. Now let me ask you, if you were in Obinna's shoe, would you have continued sacrificing everything for your family, or would you have drawn the same boundary he finally drew? I'll genuinely love to hear your thoughts, so tell me in the comments. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs this reminder today. Until our next story, take care of your family, but don't forget to take care of yourself too.